Whether it's because the controls are janky, the story's soul-crushing, or maybe it just doesn't work, we live in an age where even the biggest, most profitable gaming companies shovel unfinished tripe out the door under the guise of AAA publishing, only to patch it out in the ensuing weeks. At least you hope they patch it. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games you regretted playing. Number 10, Lifeline. Lifeline was a game of such novel conception it was bound to fail. Innovative to a fault, it was one of the first major games to embrace voice command functionality. And embrace it, Lifeline certainly did. Known as Operator's Side in Japan, this 2003 Konami release came out on the PS2. Did you know the PS2 even had voice control features? If you did, it was probably because of this game. Set on a space station, you played as a fellow stuck in a security office, acting as the handler for a waitress turned reluctant commando. The game starts off with enough fun to keep you entertained for a while, and then you actually have to play the game. Controlling Rio entirely by voice command in 2003 was just a ridiculous pipe dream, especially in a survival horror setting. Rio talks back, fails to understand your commands, and wastes ammo like it grows on space trees. And if you need her to target a specific weak point on a monster, now's not the time to sit down. No, Rio, now isn't the time, but it's a good thing I'm already sitting down. Number 9, Spectral Force Genesis. Strategy games can be traced back to the original board games of antiquity. Your Total Wars, your Civilizations, all centered around the premise of running a faction, nation, or tribe. Harvest resources, gather an army, conquer your neighbors, rinse and repeat until the whole map is your chosen color. For those who like a little more plot to their grand strategy games, well, that takes a little more effort to find. Then comes along Spectral Force Genesis, a grand strategy game set in the Fire Emblem-esque world of the Spectral Force series. Boasting over 150 characters from about 30 factions, over a handful of which are playable, filled with beefy anime men, scantily clad elven women, and furries, what could possibly go wrong? Well, one of the most important things to a strategy game is, you guessed it, strategy. But in the end, the whole thing is a slot machine RPG. Every turn of the game you get to perform one action, and that action is randomized. You don't even get to choose what you do each turn. Don't get the action you want? Too bad, just skip your turn. Number 8, Saints Row 2022. Pitched as a return to the original tone and action of the originals, the excitement for 2022's Saints Row was quite high. Confusing as it was to call a series reboot by the same name as the original, which came out in 2006, fans wanted more Saints Row, and with the last release being DLC Gat Outta Hell in 2015, they were drooling at the prospect of a new game in the series. But the game released in a very unfinished state, filled with bugs, glitches, and infuriated fans. The game had been delayed until August, originally being planned to hit the streets in February, but it didn't seem to matter. A day one patch helped, but it wasn't enough to make things work properly, and what worked was fairly run-of-the-mill. Fans of the over-the-top antics were disappointed by the more grounded story and mechanics, while fans of the original were let down by a mediocre story. Judging by the, as of the time of writing, 2.6 user score on Metacritic, fans are not pleased by it. Number 7, Duke Nukem Forever. Look, we all had an edgy phase to our lives. Some of us were emo, some of us grew out of it, and some of us grew into it. For those who put our edgelord years behind us in our teens, it wasn't nearly as intriguing to see cruelty and rudeness for the sake of humor. Sure, a lowbrow boob joke still makes us chuckle, but we can't ride the wave of misogyny, cruelty, and penis jokes for a whole video game anymore. Times were certainly different back when the first Duke Nukem game came out in 1991, where games barely even had storylines. It wasn't until 96's Duke Nukem 3D that the series really became associated with sex, graphic violence, and one-liners. Arguably intended to be biting satire, mostly of the 80s action film industry. Cut to 15 years later, and we were all disappointed in Duke Nukem Forever. What had been biting, humorous chicanery became graphic for the sake of being graphic. And speaking of graphics, those could have used some work too. With dated visuals, poor controls, and bad level design, even the edgelords who still leaned into the humor, no longer even vaguely satirical, had nothing to enjoy here. Number 6, BattleTech 2018. If you're a fan of giant mechs and tactical combat, then you've likely heard of BattleTech. The franchise has been all over the map, a cartoon in the 90s, the Mech Warrior series of first-person mech piloting games, and the thing we'll be talking about today, 2018's tactical action game simply called BattleTech. With a decent enough story, interesting NPCs, and enjoyable battles and missions, what could possibly have gone wrong? A regular refrain you hear from fans of the game is that the lack of being able to utilize a second squad of mechs, called a lance, is a huge limiting factor to the game. A big part of the game is upgrading your ship, better hangar to store more mechs, better dormitory for hiring more pilots, better facilities to keep the pilots happy. But since you can only send 4 mechs per mission, it quickly becomes apparent you're going to have 4 aces and never use the other pilots. With a second lance, you don't need a lot of mechs either. It's such a missed opportunity that makes playing an otherwise great game feel so wasted once you're done. Number 5. Any MMO when you were younger. When asked about games they regret playing, a terrifyingly high number of gamers respond with the same answer. I wish I hadn't played insert MMO here so much all those years ago. It's no secret that massively multiplayer online games are designed to suck you in and keep you planted in your chair, making their money from subscriptions, microtransactions, and in some cases, an old-fashioned purchase. No one is immune to the soul-sucking gameplay of an MMO. Even Henry Cavill almost missed out on the role of a lifetime because he missed a phone call during a WoW raid. In the end, it seems like a lot of folks have lost touch with their guildmates and have more memories of grinding loot and figuring out metas than they do of good times once they look back a few years later. Number 4. Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Mirror's Edge was such a novel idea that hadn't been accomplished in such a beautiful way in gaming before. Sure, there were plenty of first-person games, even a few that do the whole always in first-person idea, such as 2004's Breakdown, but the shimmering, colourful parkour simulator that is Mirror's Edge was something really special. It even got a side-scrolling platformer spin-off with the same name, infuriatingly enough, and that came out 4 years later and was pleasantly received. As we've said numerous times, what could possibly go wrong? Mirror's Edge Catalyst can and did go wrong. Catalyst wound up being perfectly serviceable with some things that were even better than the original, but it just couldn't capture the magic of the first, with a much more boring storyline, unlikable sidekicks, and combat just as lackluster as the first. In the end, Catalyst is disappointing not because it was bad, but because it just wasn't good enough. Especially with the fact that Catalyst was supposed to be a reboot, overwriting the original story. The original hadn't been a groundbreaking story, sure, but it was definitely better than this underperforming reboot. It just makes you wish you replayed the first one. Number 3. GTA The Trilogy, the Definitive Edition. Oh, to revisit Liberty City, Vice City, and San Andreas in the Grand Theft Auto universe. But with HD graphics, better UI, and improved controls and checkpointing. But things went very, very wrong. Handed off to Grove Street Games, the whole package lacked the care and consideration players expected of a Rockstar game. The new graphics were worse than the original in a lot of ways, things we've touched on numerous times since the so-called Definitive Edition released. With graphics missing or poorly hitboxed, formerly passable terrain becoming indestructible, and many of the models just being stretched upscale models done by a janky AI program, it wasn't an improvement. And that was when the launcher issues were fixed and we could actually play it. Worst of all, while we were wallowing in our regret, we couldn't even go back and play the originals because Rockstar had them all removed from the digital marketplaces a week before release. So for those who hadn't played them in their original run, they had extra tears to shed walking into the disaster that was the GTA Definitive Edition. Number 2. ReCore. Directed, written, and conceptualized by the guys behind Metroid Prime, Halo, and Mega Man respectively, ReCore was set to be a giant among games. Playing as Jewel, a woman who wakes from cryosleep to learn that the planet of Far Eden is not what she'd hoped it to be, the game somehow didn't live up to the sum of its creators. Plagued with long loading times, it had a tendency to crash, especially on the Xbox One. It was barely playable at times, and when you could play it, it was largely just repetitive fetch quests and the same visuals on repeat. While the story was praised, it was locked behind a level requirement to proceed, forcing you to just grind to get ahead. In the end, the game was just a disappointment because it did have quality ideas, and some of them were even instituted well. When the Definitive Edition fixed a lot of the issues, it didn't save the poor souls who played it on release. Number 1. This War of Mine. I know what you're thinking, this list has been filled with games that missed their mark, disappointed us, or were downright broken. What is the critically and player acclaimed This War of Mine doing on this list? Well, there's basically 2 types of people in this world, at least 2 types who played This War of Mine, and both of them have a little regret in their souls. For those who thought the survival mechanics were too gamey or the progression too slow to even warrant trying, you no doubt felt betrayed by those good reviews. For those who thought the game was as fantastic as it claimed to be, you'll likely have underlying trauma induced by the heart-wrenching story beats of this game. Whether you raged at the idea of a single-use filter, or thirsty people not drinking rainwater because it wasn't clean, or you simply bawled your eyes out as you pilfered meds from an old couple to save your housemate, you were in the same boat. Pained by our decisions, mostly our decision to play such a traumatic game. That's the end of our list, but do let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any video games that you regret playing. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonnell, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.